And at one such, dimension that was flying by, I saw this really strange insect-like creature kind of lunge out at me. And because after I'd come back from this trip, and for days afterward, I was really feeling out of sorts and very, very energetically drained. And I realized in my memory about this trip that this thing had jumped out and was probably still embedded in my aura. So I did a whole kind of cleansing to, draw all the energy back into the heart, and then to, in a sense, expand it out from the heart to banish this being.
Did it work? Were you able to do that?
It really did. And, you just banish them back to where they came from. And, my gosh, sometimes things like that can really help.
And I think one of the things that people can take from what you've described, and they should certainly take seriously what you said about the psychonaut experiencing heaven and hell, is that these medicines are a sword that cuts both ways. It's like Sophocles said, no great gift enters the human sphere without an equally diabolical price to be paid for it. And so in addition to the visions that medicines can open, and they've been used by cultures throughout human history, you become incredibly vulnerable. You become, your psychic immune system is thrown open, and you become far more vulnerable to attacks that some people indeed do not really survive. And if they have underlying weaknesses in their personality, or have approached with less than the very serious intent that you obviously had, they can be destroyed by the experiences.
Well, I got to tell you, Alex, your artwork is fascinating to look at, and you could obviously tell that your mind has gone deeper than most artists to do what you do.
Well, that's very kind of you, George, and I appreciate the forum that you have given America for discussing alternative ways of looking at reality.
Okay. Very good. That's Alex Grey. By the way, his website is alexgrey.com, and he's got a book called Sacred Mirrors, The Visionary Art of Alex Grey. It is fascinating work. Jonathan, how is he looked at, and we're coming up to the break so very quickly, how is he looked at by other artists? I mean, what do they think of you?
Well, I think some will have certain jealous attitudes and that type of thing. I think some recognize him for the genius that he is. But most artists are in the place where Alex was before he went on these journeys. They're postmodern nihilists. And so for them, his artwork is a little bit too challenging for some of them, and they might not recognize it for the value that it really has.
It is a fascinating story. We'll be back with Jonathan Zapp as we talk about energy sappers. We'll get into a little bit more about some of the work of my aunt as well, right here on Coast to Coast AM. Yep, 8 feet under. Thank God it's vertical and not horizontal, if you know what I mean. My aunt concluded some time ago that the energy sapper really didn't actually know that he or she was doing this to other people. That was the thrust of her conclusion. We'll be back in a moment with Jonathan Zapp on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. I'm George Norrie with Jonathan Zapp, our guest. Jonathan, let's talk a little bit more about these sappers and parasites. And what did Carl Jung once say about them in terms of shadow projection? Explain that.
Well, what Jung said, and by the way, George, I just realized when you were announcing things that you're in the cave tonight, which I didn't realize was coming up, and that's kind of interesting and maybe synchronistic, or as you would say, there are no coincidences, because one theory about mind parasites has to do with caves and with dense stone walls, strangely enough.
Really?
I have a friend named Marcus who came up with a theory that the reason why so many hermits and spiritual adepts would go into caves, and he believed the reason why the pyramids were created with such dense walls, is that you are insulated from a certain type of psychic attack, that even though these are energetic organisms and they can pass through solid materials, that it's quite uncomfortable for them to do so. And that for this reason, ghosts will tend to, according to some lore, always pass through the same part of the wall. It's as if they've left a part of their energic body there, and it makes it a little bit easier, but they don't like to pass through solid substances. And if it's that thick, it may be still more uncomfortable.
That's
so
interesting.
Consider yourself protected right now.
Yeah, it is, and it is thick. I tell you what, the only thing that seems to leak through here, Jonathan, are crickets and millipedes. But I have a feeling they were here long before the cave was, to tell you the truth.
Right.
But shadow, when Jung talked about shadow projection, is that the same as what we've always talked about on this program before, shadow people?
Well, no, not exactly. Although the shadow people could be visual artifacts of parasites, particularly if they are the preta, the sort that the Buddhists called pretas, the hungry ghosts, would sound a lot like some of the reports about shadow people and some of the nighttime attacks that people would frequently describe to me when they come for dream interpretation, that I'd notice would be totally devoid of psychological content. They'd be very stereotyped. They'd be very similar, like, with the old hag syndrome and with the night terrors. You would hear the same shadowy figure. There would be no, it didn't say it looked like my dad, or there would be no, psychological individual content to these experiences. But what Jung meant by shadow projection was something that could also be influenced by parasites, but was a tendency that creates so many of the evils that we experience on the planet, and especially what's going on with the Middle East. It was that people would be unwilling to recognize and accept their own shadow, their own personal darkness, and so they would tend to project it out onto others. And a classic example would be the Nazis, who would claim that the Jews were trying to rule the world. Meanwhile, they wanted to have a 1,000-year Reich. Well, the fanatical Islamists say about the same thing, and yet they want to have a worldwide jihad, and they feel that they haven't fulfilled their mission until the entire planet is their particular Muslim sect. And, not just even Muslim. It's got to be Sunni, or it's got to be Shiite, or whatever. And, in fact, there's even a connection between the Nazis and the Muslims, and even Hezbollah. There's a couple of images that Lex linked up on your site where people can see a Muslim Nazi flag from World War II, where the people don't realize that the Nazis actually had some of these fanatical Islamists working with them. There is also an image of some of them bowing in their traditional prayers while amongst a Nazi corps. Other images on the same website, those came from, show Hezbollah guerrillas in their initiation ceremony, and they have the Nazi salute. And so there is a certain strange spirit that Jung recognized about the Nazis, and their intense shadow projection onto the Jews. They seem to be possessed. You can try and explain these things, and many people will criticize what I'm saying and say, well, it was our bad foreign policies that created this, and so forth. You could say the same thing about the Nazis. You could say that the Treaty of Versailles that humiliated Germany created Hitler and the Nazis, but it's just really nonsense. It created more fertile conditions. But there was this type of fanaticism before there was a U.S. government, before there was an Israel, before there were globalizing corporations. And its extremity and intensity cannot be explained very easily. Now, Jung was very interested in, considered himself a Gnostic. He was very interested in the Gnostics. And it was only after World War II, after this tremendous evil happened, that the Nag Hammadi library was discovered out in the desert, which contained almost everything we know about Gnosticism. And the Gnostics believed there were Archons. They warned us about the time that we are facing right now. They warned us even before there was an Islam. They said that the Archons, that were parasitic deities that map onto very well what Alex described, would manipulate us through religious ideologies. This is exactly what they said. In fact, there's even a Gnostic text that I put up on the website and the thing about Alex that shows parallels between his painting and an ancient Gnostic text.
They didn't know when it would happen. They just knew it would.
Well, they knew it wasn't so. It was both a prophecy and it was an actuality while they were alive. This has been going on for a couple of thousand years.
Right, it's been ongoing.
Killed off,
sure,
by other religious fanatics. So this is not new. But now the stakes are just getting ratcheted up there even higher. And it's one of the most efficient ways that we can be controlled to keep up the harvest of negative energies. Because parasites have a certain inferiority in that they cannot directly access the source of nourishment the way we do. They need to step down our energy. They can only feed off of, apparently, the baser human energies. They can't feed off of love and tranquility and consciousness and this type of thing. They can feed off of fear and anger and desire and rage and passion and this type of thing. One of the most efficient ways to keep us in a kind of state of delightful fermentation.
Chaos, I guess.
Right, exactly. That makes us, a delicious feast for them, is through a fanatical ideology, especially a religious one, that completely controls a person's outlook. Now, one very hopeful sign in this is one of the greatest Coast shows I've ever heard. I think it was Wednesday when you had on, was his name Waleed?
Well, Waleed Shuabat.
Right.
That's right, Wednesday night. Yes.
Yeah, I mean...
Thursday night, actually. No, Thursday night.
Thursday night. That was, and anybody that doesn't have Streamlink needs to get it, if only to hear that one show, because that was one of the most important interviews I've ever heard, and it was all about mind parasite infection and recovery. And it's hopeful, because here is this person who describes how from the earliest age he was being inculcated and totally accepted an ideology of fanatical and delusory hate. And then his confrontation with it and discovering that it was a bunch of lies and his pulling himself out of it and reversing it. Well, that is a tremendously hopeful occasion. Even if this is one person. William James once said, all that's necessary to disprove the notion that all crows are black is one white crow. Well, this gentleman is a white crow, and what one man can do, another can do, or a woman. And so the fact that he was able to get out of that shows that the human spirit can transcend this type of infestation, which, according to the Gnostics, would particularly take the form of extreme ideologies.
When I was putting this program together, Jonathan, and I was talking about what has occurred on this planet lately, and I did a lot of thinking when I was on this airplane, because I wanted to see what things were like at airports, and let me tell you, it's a hassle to travel. You got to. But, I mean, things are just so crazy right now. I mean, it's just a hassle. But I'm at a point now where I don't even like to use the word terrorist anymore. I think what this is a battle between good and evil. And I think there's a lot of evil out there. And I really believe that even in a peaceful existence, evil will still crop up. My question to you is does evil and good balance out, or will evil win one day, or will good win one day? I mean, can evil be that powerful that it would win?
Well, I'm a huge optimist. If you may remember from our previous show, I see us heading toward a transcendent evolutionary event that actually takes an intensification of darkness to create the change to bring that about. And I think we're in a time of heightened, what Terence McKenna called novelty, of change and transformation. And what you would expect to happen in such a time is that the outer edge of light and the outer edge of dark will both intensify. But because there's free will, I believe, even though there's probably less of it than we would like to think, things tremble in the balance. In the ancient Jewish book, the Talmud, it's written that before God created the earth, he created many other planets as experiments, and that these experiments failed and were destroyed. And one rabbi suggested to me maybe the earth too will be destroyed. But our efforts to transcend that battle of opposites are still worthwhile. And I think we are seeing it intensifying as we are getting toward an evolutionary event horizon. And the face of evil changes. It could be a serial killer one day. It could be the Nazis. It could be, the Christian fundamentalists in the Middle Ages were the ones that were the inquisitors and that burned millions of women as witches.
It could be a politician who gets elected.
Absolutely. It could be in our own government. It could be the Illuminati. It could be all kinds of things. And that's something that people have trouble with. The whole idea of political correctness is it's basically a template of what projections are allowed and what aren't. political correctness says you can project the dark force into the U.S. government and onto Israel and to corporations, but not onto exotic cultures. But one of the strange things about the fanatical Islamists, the Muslims, that is even stranger than the Nazis, is their violence toward their own women. This is unreported, but I do some work with a nonprofit called womensassistance.com, and there are 100,000 Muslim women each year that are killed in honor killings and stove burnings, for walking too proud, for laughing out loud in public. People can read a document on the front page of my site called Jihad Against the Feminine by my friend Sean Moffat, who has done tremendous work to raise money right now, raising money for a safe house in Pakistan run by a Muslim woman, Shanice Bakari, who's taken in 6,000 burned women in the last 6.5 years
6,000
from one town.
Burned women. Oh, my
God. Right. Most of them don't live. And so this is what they are doing to their own people. And it's strange when you can overcome the will toward self-preservation and attack your own kind to such a degree. They're in the July 31st Time magazine, they mention in passing a mural in Iran that shows a woman with a suicide vest on. And the caption of the mural says, "Motherhood is great, but martyrdom is greater."
God.
And, this death force, Freud called it thanatos. We find it not just in the Islamists. Let's not make it all about them, because that just leads toward shadow projection. For example, in Stalin's Russia, the KGB, here they killed millions of their own fellow Russian citizens who were completely innocent, even of sins that only a communist would recognize as a sin. And instead of just hauling them off and taking them off to the gulag or shooting them in the streets, they would go to elaborate efforts. They would, for example, have a KGB agent come up to you in a bar and for hours buy you drinks and pretend to be your friend and then denounce you to make it more terrifying. There was no reason for this. It served no purpose, just like it serves no purpose for them to destroy their own women.
That's pure
and yet
evil.
They do it out of, exactly, in a way that we cannot explain through ordinary human psychology. And that's why I think we have to be willing to look at an unknown factor like parasites and things above us in the food chain that could be manipulating us.
Well, all things considered, though, Jonathan, will evil win or will good win? Blow by blow, who wins? What wins?
Well, I think it's like a great drama, George. It's more exciting not to know. And I think we do our best efforts when we feel it hangs in the balance. Like Galadriel said to the Ring Fellowship, your quest rests upon the edge of a knife. Stray but a little, and you will fall to the ruin of all.
See, I've always believed that eventually good will win. I mean, we're going to have some battles we're going to lose, but eventually the war of good versus evil will be won by good. I mean, that's the way I think. That's the way I believe. I hope I'm right.
Well, I think my bet is with you, George. And if you remember from our previous show, when we talked about the singularity archetype, the evidence in this archetype that sort of bubbles up from the collective unconscious is that what seems like the darkest of the dark is revealed from a higher vantage to be a transcendent evolutionary event. So I think that we need tremendous pressure. It's like the dark night of the soul or the initiation rite that takes you to the edge of death. I think the species is setting that up for itself. I think it needs to intensify the darkness and the suffering to create change. And so I'm with you. I think that something very transcendent can come out of all this, but it's going to be a very rough ride getting there.
I was talking months ago about a guy here in St. Louis he would walk into a lounge, and he was a nice guy. I mean, he was a nice guy, but for some reason, Jonathan, he exhausted you just by being next to you. He was an energy sapper. And as my aunt would say, this guy had no idea he was doing it. He wasn't doing it to hurt people. He wasn't being intentional, but he was wiping out the place. He was clearing it out. It got to a point where in a lounge of 100 people, the only two left were the bartender and this guy. And the bartender was on the other side of the bar. I mean, in the far corner, away from him. He couldn't handle it anymore. About a month or so ago, we ran into this guy again. Mm-hmm. And for some reason, I don't know what he did, but his whole persona had changed. He actually had a few people around him laughing and enjoying his company. But he also looked different. He changed his appearance. I don't know what he did, but somewhere along the line, somebody must have, maybe he was listening to this program, because I've talked about him a couple times. Maybe it dawned on him that he was doing this, and maybe he just wasn't aware of it.
Well, exactly, and those people can change, often without realizing they're changed. Here's what your aunt, Dr. Shafika Karigula, wrote on Breakthrough to Creativity. There are certain people who do not seem to be able to pick up their own energy from the surrounding ocean of energy which the sensitives describe. They appear to take their energy pre-digested from the people in their immediate vicinity. So this makes them like the parasites, in that they need their energy stepped down instead of accessing what different cultures call chi or prana or life energy. They need to draw it from other people. They don't have a centered enough personality where they can draw it themselves. And she also writes, such individuals may be totally unaware of their energy pull in other people. They may simply feel better when they are in company of more vital people. Any individual who remains in the vicinity of the sapper for too long begins to feel desperately exhausted for no reason that they can understand. And they feel baffled and bewildered, and they try and escape but feel guilty, and so forth. Now, something that I've wondered is, it could just be that this is a pattern in nature.
Could
it's
be.
also a pattern sort of entrained by nature by the fact that we're maybe surrounded by other parasites doing exactly the same kind of transaction. It's also possible that, and this is pure speculation, but I did have one personal dramatic experience with such
a sapper?
Well, this was beyond a sapper. This was a true vampire, somebody who actually told me they were a vampire, and seemed to have a kind of symbiont-like relationship with some other entity that lived within him that was capable of working through him to draw energy in a much more massive way.
So he might have been possessed.
There's a very fine line. I think possession may be, I think I'm giving a secular point of view, but to a religious person would say, well, you're talking about demonology and you're talking about possession, and I would say, you're right. These are maybe just different flavors or ways of describing the same thing. And if you want, I could tell you the story about this person, or we could just talk about it.
Let's get that story when we come back. And also, as you know, Jonathan, I am not a fan of clowns. I love the Shriners. I think they do a great job for people and children, but I just don't like clowns. And you have something to say about clowns and parasites. So I want to get this tie-in and find out what the heck's going on. We'll be back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. By the way, you're welcome. I didn't have an opportunity to thank you for sending me those thank you emails when we opened up the free StreamLink weekend a week or so ago. We'll do that a couple times a year for you, those of you who are not StreamLink members, so you can participate and enjoy and get a little taste of the flavor of what StreamLink is all about and the podcasting and everything else. A lot of you signed up for it just with that free weekend. So, but we will do that again, and just figure every 6 months or so we'll do another free StreamLink weekend just for you. ZapOracle.com is Jonathan's website, which is linked up at coasttocoastam.com. You can take a look at the many things that he has done in his career as we approach his work with the mind. And I really like what he's done, too, with prophecy. All right, Jonathan, tell us a little bit about this vampire, if you would.
Okay, well, this is a very complex story, and I'm going to have to give you a shortened version of it. If people want the full version, it's in my essay, Mind Parasites, Energy Parasites, Vampires, on the website for free, or they can get the CD audio set I've just produced called the Mind Parasite Matrix, where there's an even fuller description of this episode. But cutting out some of the history, I knew a very young couple in my travels. They were both very charismatic and very good looking. And I didn't see him for about a year, and then I came across the young woman who's I'll call Sapphire, a pseudonym,
Sapphire.
Sapphire, just what I came up with in the essay for whatever reasons, but it was very exotically beautiful, sort of racially unidentifiable. And after I hadn't seen her for a year, there was an amazing transformation. She'd become a much more open person. She seemed like a borderline personality type who, was just pathologically shy, the year before. And so we had a couple of very good talks. And then a couple of weeks later, I hadn't seen the male part of this duo, whose name was Nicholas, yet. But a couple of weeks later, I get a phone call, and it's from Nicholas, and Sapphire is about to go off to another country with another guy after they had been together for 3.5 years.
And breaks his heart, no doubt, right?
Right. So he's totally heartbroken. He asked if he could come over and talk to me and get an I Ching reading, something I do for people. And of course I said yes. At the time I was traveling, and I was in a small RV. But I said, yeah, come over, and I'll make some tea, and we'll talk about it. And so we did a couple of I Ching readings. We talked about it, and then suddenly he said, okay, I'm talked out about this. I've been talking to everybody I know about this all day. I'd like to change the subject. And I'm like, okay, go ahead. And he says, I think I'm a vampire. I'm like, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, I feed off of other people's energy. I said, well, can you give me an example? And he said, well, you. Ever since I've known you, I've fed off of your energy, and there's even been a sexual undercurrent to it, which seemed to come totally out of left field.
Yeah, I would guess so, yeah.
Right. I had no inkling of that whatsoever. And I'm like, well, what do you mean by that? Everybody feeds off of each other's energy to some extent. And I was basically making a classic mistake, which I've done before, which is I was being overly sympathetic and not really taking what he was saying seriously enough. I thought, he's traumatized, this is low self-esteem, blah, blah, blah. I was just falling into pop psychology in my own mind and not heeding a very specific warning. And anyway, we talked some more about a variety of different things. He told me a lot of history of his life I didn't know before, about how he'd been very promiscuous, he'd been abandoned by his parents. He had a very strange history that you wouldn't have guessed to look at him, because he was always perfectly groomed and seemed very polished, but he had actually come from a very violent background and had been very violent himself as well, as he confessed with some shame. Anyway, this talk went well into the night, and suddenly he realized that the buses that would take him back to the town where he lived had stopped, and he had no place to go, and it was an extremely cold and windy night, and he asked if he could stay on my RV. And of course I had to say yes, and I had a sleeping loft that could easily have slept 3 people. So I said, look, go take the far end of the loft, and I'll take the near side when I get up there, because I wanted him to go to sleep first, because I'm a dreamer and I have dream recall. The price I pay for that is being a super light sleeper, so unless everybody else is asleep, I can't go to sleep.
Well, plus he also said he was interested in you, so you definitely wanted him to go to sleep
exactly.
first, right?
Right. So anyway, he seemed to fall asleep immediately, and I collected my thoughts and so forth, and then I got up in the sleeping loft, and I took the far near side to give as much personal space as possible. Well, I was lying there for a couple of minutes, and then he seemed to roll over while he was asleep, so that 3 parts of his body were just slightly touching mine, his toes, his knees, and his forehead. And I'm like, well, it's a little uncomfortable, but I don't want to wake this guy up. He's had such a traumatic day, and so forth. And so eventually I fall asleep. Well, sometime in the middle of the night, some kind of internal warning system woke me wide awake in just a splintered moment. And what I experienced was one of the most shocking and anomalous things I've ever experienced. What I experienced was this massive energy transfer coming out of me and into him. Something was siphoning out so much energy from me that I felt if this continued for even a few more heartbeats, I wouldn't be able to resist it. I don't even know if I would be me anymore. And at the same time, and these are going to sound like a sequence of perceptions, but it was sort of like one of those moments where there's a multi-layered simultaneity of many different perceptions. I was aware of another entity up on the loft with us. It seemed to be a dark, rotating cloud, lenticular in shape, like a spiral galaxy, like a double convex lens shape, and it was rotating. And I sensed that it was supervising this energy transfer in some way. And as I became more aware and my will to resist seemed to emerge like, a sword pulled out of a sheath, because I'm suddenly aware that, something is trying to, like, take all my energy away, and I'm gathering my will, and at the same time, my mind is coming alive, because I'm like, I've been studying mind parasites, and like, wow, now I'm seeing something, really happening, and that took me out of the fear aspect. And so my energy was no longer burning at a temperature, I believe at least, of course this is all speculative, that this organism could feed off of. And then it made a kind of very weird sound, a sound that I can't possibly reproduce or describe, but the meaning of it was completely clear at the moment. It was the sound of a hungry animal interrupted in its feeding. It was a sound of, like, deep frustration. And at that moment, the entity vanished, the energy transfer stopped, and it was just the two of us lying on the sleeping loft. Well, I laid awake for a while. There was no longer any feeling of a threat. I just stayed awake to make sure nothing else was going to happen and to just indelibly imprint this experience into my memory. The next morning, when he woke up, I told Nicholas about what had happened, and he didn't seem the least bit surprised. And it reminded me that he had told me the day before that he was a vampire. I certainly can't say he pulled the wool over my eyes. And we parted on good terms, and I've never seen him since.
Could that be a reason why he broke up with this girl, because she couldn't, stand it anymore?
Well, he thought so. That was one of the things that he said, and that train of the conversation led to, is he wondered if maybe that was why she wasn't staying with him. But on the other hand, and she also confirmed this, because this is one of the strange twists of this case, he had a tremendously positive effect on her. And he was in many ways a very talented and charismatic person. So I see him as a victim. He according to his own testimony, he may have been abused as a child by his own father when between ages 1 through 4, which he has no memory. It seemed plausible in his case. There was no, like, incest survivor self-pity in him. It just seemed like he may have been right about that. And it led to very self-destructive, promiscuous behavior. And he may have been infected with something and not been fully in control of what was going on.
Are there some people, Jonathan, who need to be near these psychic vampires, these energy sappers? I mean, we talk about the energy sapper, the psychic vampire, sometimes being aware, sometimes not, of what he or she does. But what about the victims? Do they need to get fed off of?
Well, I think that's a good point, George. There's a Annie Lennox of the Eurythmics. There's a line from one of her classic songs. Some people want to abuse you. Some people want to be abused. There are the sadists and there are the masochists. There was the German cannibal that was in the courts a couple years ago when they were trying to decide if this was voluntary manslaughter or what exactly it was, because he had advertised that he wanted to eat somebody and had found a very willing volunteer, and they proceeded to satisfy each other's desires. So there are some people that do want to be devoured, but you have to wonder here, we talked about possession, are they being controlled by parasites? Because we know, if you read the book Parasite Rex, we know that even microbial parasites have an ability to take over the will of a host organism that's much more complex than they are. For example, rabies.
Well, but how many times have we seen couples, maybe the guy with the girl or the girl with the guy, where one of them treats the other one rotten, yet the other one seems to keep coming back for more, seems to be, I don't want to say they enjoy it, but they tend to be more with the person who treats them rotten than the good person, the good guy or the good girl. Why is that?
Well, this is a very classic pattern, and of course there's a certain caution we have to say here, which is that we don't want to fall into the fallacy of attributing everything to the parasites, because we don't want to rule out ordinary neurotic psychology. The two kind of blur into each other, and we can fall into a dangerous thing of, like, the devil made me do it, where we can attribute everything to parasites. We don't really know where they leave off and regular human craziness begins. And we definitely don't want to disempower people into thinking that there's outside forces controlling them, because your psyche is your sovereign realm. And there are a lot of people in these abusive relationships, and they need to take responsibility for it and take themselves out of the abusive relationship. But you really have to wonder how this works. Sometimes the parasite is spread by what they call a meme, M-E-M-E. It's a unit of cultural transmission. And this can create these very destructive relationships. And sometimes I can give you an example of how one person saying one sentence can create a parasitic infestation in somebody that may govern their relationships for the rest of their life. Let's say, for example, we have a very sensitive high school student. Let's make him a male in this case. And he really cares about a particular girlfriend. And they have a soulful relationship. But maybe she succumbs to some temptation. Of course, it could be the reverse. It could be female to male. I'm not saying that females are more likely to succumb to temptations than males, far from it. But she, in typical high school fashion or adult fashion, cheats on him, and he's devastated. And so now he's feeling this tremendous heartbroken feeling, and often adults, disparage what adolescents feel, but for them it's, as intense as anything. And he goes up to his best friend seeking help. And his best friend, so influential in this moment, and he's so vulnerable, says to him, well, that's just the way they are. So just blank them and forget them. Now, in that one sentence, if it's accepted, and this is a meme, it's a unit of cultural transmission, that could then govern his eros and the conduct of his relationships for the rest of his life. And in that conduct, he will spread that contagion, that soul-destroying contagion, to many others. So there are many ways in which parasites can occur. That's why they say there are many species. It could be an idea, a thought form, that then it comes to dominate somebody. So many people in these abusive relationships picked up poisonous ideas, poisonous patterns from the way people have treated them in the past, and then they go ahead and keep reproducing that.
It's almost as if they need to feed on it or get fed off it. I've seen it time and time again, Jonathan, and it just boggles my mind. I just don't understand it.
Well, these are very mind-boggling things, and they cost people their lives. They cost people their souls, and they also happen in the world. Everything we see, it's kind of like, a fractal, the small part recapitulates the whole. That abusive relationship that we see between people is recapitulated by the nation-states, where, these cycles of oppression and violence just keep on going for centuries. And sometimes it's hard to tell what's really behind all of that.
Okay, what's wrong with my clown phobia? What's happening to it?
Well, there's nothing wrong with it. It's something that seems to be fairly universal, and I think it has to do also with kind of weird caricatured representations of the human form. Puppets sometimes too turn up in horror movies, and clowns as well. For example, Stephen King's classic novel It.
Yes.
Which was made. I didn't read the book, but the movie was brilliant.
With the pointy teeth.
Right, and there's some kind of gigantic parasitic organism that lives under this town, but when it emerges and personifies itself to bring terror and abduction and horror into the lives of the people of the town, it appears as Pennywise the clown. I had a mind parasite experience in Mexico 2 years ago. I was traveling to some of the ancient Mayan sites with my friend John Major Jenkins. I know you've had him on the show.
Oh,
recently.
sure. Great guy.
Absolutely. And we were heading toward, we were in Chichen Itza, and I started to feel this pulsation of energy. And this is in broad daylight. And I started to see these horrific images, and they'd be lit stroboscopically, as if by lightning. And the first image that I saw was you're not going to like this, George, but was an army of clowns with empty eye sockets.
Oh, God.
And they had...
Trying to give me nightmares now?
Well, I hope not, but their skin was covered with a white powder, like talcum powder, and they had floppy, organic-looking ears, like elephant ears, and underneath the white powder were cancerous, metastasizing lesions. But then when I summoned my will to like destroy this image, then they took the form of like stinging insects. And what I realized was, like the devil has the power to assume a pleasing form. It also has the power to assume unpleasing forms, specifically to terrorize you. So I think what's frightening about clowns is that they're kind of simulacrum. They're kind of like a semi-organic but semi-inorganic representation of the human form that has a resemblance to some of these phantoms that haunt our mind and haunt our unconscious, that may be representations of the Archons or the Parasites, where they appear in these grotesque caricatures to frighten us. And I just want to, John Wayne Casey, the serial killer,
he dressed up like a clown. He sure did.
But I think we should also add, in fairness, that we're not judging some of the wonderful people who work for Cirque du Soleil or clowns as entertainers, and they may be.
Well, like I said, the Shriners, when they get on those little tiny tricycles and they go do their little clown routine. I mean, those are wonderful people. I'm talking about just clowns in general. I mean, I remember going to a mall a couple of years ago, and some clown was making balloons for kids, and he kind of looked at me. And just imagine this for a second, Jonathan. A look in slow motion with this very evil grin and these beady red eyes from a distance. And I mean, those are scary things.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that there are some very scary people who put on masks. I think the other thing is the mask, because this is something that we face all the time, and is one of the things that your aunt, Dr. Carigula, pointed out about the energy sappers, is that these would be people that would be, she put it, volubly altruistic. They would always be talking about how much they care about others and care about causes and care about their friends, just like John Wayne Gacy, was dressing up as a clown to help children in the hospital. And he belonged to all those, civic groups, and people thought he was a great guy. But underneath the masks that are presented to us, there may be predators and parasites, and we all kind of sense that. And so sometimes when we see these masked figures, I think Stanley Kubrick did a very powerful job with them in Eyes Wide Shut.
I love that movie.
Right, me too. I think that's an image of the parasites as well. There's a number of some of the most haunting movies out there that I think really have a theme about the parasites. A lot of the David Lynch films. The most recent Batman film is one of the very best, Scarecrow. We have this very good-looking guy played by Cillian Murphy, but what does he do? He sprays you with neuropharmaceuticals that make you intensely afraid, so he appears haunting.
Jonathan, we're going to be back. We're going to have phone calls with you. Those of you who want to share some of your psychic vampire stories, or perhaps you just have a question or two, it'll be your turn next. I'm George Norrie. This is Coast to Coast AM. Okay, we're going to take your phone calls. If you want to share your psychic vampire stories with us, or you have a question of Jonathan Zapp, you're next on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast with our special guest, Jonathan Zapp, and we'll take your phone calls in just a moment as well. Jonathan, on just somewhat of a different subject, Zapp Oracle, interesting name for a website. How'd that happen?
Well, it's not because I think I'm an oracle. It's named after an oracle that I created with the help of two wonderful people, Drew Stricker, the webmaster, who did all the graphics, David Thomas is the software engineer who wrote the code, and I've been working on it for over 25 years. There are over 304 cards. There are going to be hundreds more added, and people can interact with it for free and do readings on general life reading, relationships, problems, and all kinds of different things like that.
Okay, well, let's go to some of the calls. Let's pick it up by going to our first-time caller line. You're on the air with us. Hi there.
Hello?
Yeah, hi. Do you have a story or question?
No, my name is Nancy, and I'm from Canoga Park, California, and I was listening about clowns and puppets.
Yes.
And I thought that was very interesting. It caught my attention because I've always been afraid of them as a child at a very young age, and it really caught my attention to hear that because I knew there was always something
Do you remember the moment, Nancy, that started your fear of clowns?
No, not really. I've known there was always something very strange about them, but scary. And that's just so interesting that somebody else sees that too.
Oh, but there's more than somebody else. A lot of people feel this way. One of the things that I didn't like a long time ago, Jonathan, in the Poltergeist movie, do you remember the clown that was sitting on the kid's chair in his bedroom, rocking back and forth?
Vaguely. Haven't seen the movie in so long, but
you won't like that scene. Then I think the thing ended up under his bed or something like that.
Well, when we find a pattern like this, these relate to the archetypes. It means something. If it was just you that had a fixation on clowns, we might wonder about you. But when we find, like Nancy and like many other people have this, when we find somebody like a serial killer, like John Wayne Gacy himself chooses to be a clown, when an artist who's in touch with the unconscious, like Stephen King, chooses a clown to represent the personification of a parasitic force, we have to kind of wonder. There's a pattern there. That pattern's got to mean something.
Yeah. Worry about me if I like clowns, not if I don't.
Maybe so.
Let's go to our wild card line. Welcome to Coast. You're on the air. Hi.
This is Christian. I'm calling from Texas.
Hi, Christian. Go ahead, please.
Well, I wanted to talk about clowns. I don't mean to scare you, George, but in Lauren Coleman's book, Mysterious America, he talks about several incidents. I don't remember where they happened. They happened in 1981, 82, and in which a number of incidents in which people would be seen and they'd be dressed up like clowns with a devil face on their shirt. And they were never caught. Sometimes they'd be sitting one would be sitting in a van, and the other one would be, another one would get into the van with the one driving.
Yeah.
And this was a series of mysterious events that Lauren Coleman wrote about, and I just wonder if they've happened again.
I don't know if they've happened again.
Yeah.
But I will check with Lauren the next time he's on the program.
Okay, great.
Okay, great. Thanks again. But there are a lot of people with this clown phobia.
Yeah, it's interesting that seems to be the first thing coming up.
East of the Rockies, you're on Coast to Coast with us. Hi there.
Hey, how are you?
Good, sir. Thanks.
I had a question for your guest.
Okay.
If you have a suspecting entity or parasite, how would you get rid of that?
Well, I'm really glad you asked, because that is the $64 million question, and I can only touch on it briefly here because there's a lot more detail on Mind Parasite Matrix and on some of the writings on my website. But the first thing is to recognize that your psyche and your body is your sovereign realm. If you really summon your will to resist, then you cannot be taken over. And the other thing is that one of the reports about these entities, and I've noticed myself, is that they will create cravings in people for things like sugar, alcohol, things that create a certain metabolism and cause your energy to be at a certain bandwidth, color, temperature, vibration. These are generally the foods that are sort of hypercaloric, hypermetabolic, and so forth, high glycemic, and so on. So if you can eliminate some of those foods, that's another way to do it. And then a third thing is it all depends on how does the entity attach itself to you. What have you experienced?
I wouldn't say it was. I wouldn't say it's in a person. It's more of a, like, I feel maybe like a negative energy following me.
Mm-hmm. Like a evil spirit or something like that.
I possibly through drinking and the people that I've met. Possibly, I don't know. I've seen some medicine men before, and they just they clean. I've been cleansed and things like that. But it just always seems to it'll be fine for a while, then it would attach itself, and then I just end up having a bad luck streak or something like that. I just feel like I have some like this energy that's with me that somehow I keep drawing back to me.
Well, one of the they're, as I say, different species, and what this sounds a little bit like relates to the hungry ghost theory of mind parasites or type of mind parasites. One of your former guests, Dr. Samuel Sagan, has written a book about this. The Buddhists believed, and some other cultures did as well, that when some people die, that a astral fragment is left behind. That's sort of a denser part of their energy body that cannot go on to the next plane, and it stays sort of in a between place, a lower astral realm, where it continues to be haunted by the appetites that drove it. And I think we're also seeing from the caller that he's kind of giving us a hint of where these things can be picked up. Socially dense environments in which substances are being abused, because in those circumstances, just like in Alex's report, except that because he was a visionary, he was able to make good use of it, but some of the other people that were acting out chaotically obviously weren't. In those circumstances, there's a boundary-dissolved state. There's a state where people can be more influenced by these entities, and people can pick them up from each other. Just like we pick up microbiological germs from each other, just like sexual encounters are a great disease vector for the microbiological plane, they can also be for these other organisms, it seems. And so is there a certain time or some kind of common pattern that you notice when it seems to be following you or giving you trouble?
Well, is there a way, Jonathan, that, like you said all you simply have to do is kind of envelop yourself to fight this off, and it would be that they can't get to you. But what if the evil, I'll call it evil, people call it a psychic vampire, what if the evil is stronger than the individual is? Then what happens?
Well, that's a very good question, and I don't want to give a glib answer to that. The Gnostics believed that the Archons would steal souls. In the Gnostic text that I put up alongside Alex's painting, they specifically warn about this. Some people may not be sufficiently strong and have the resources to fight back. The other two of Alex's paintings suggest that as well. I think some people are overtaken. There are many, many suicides and people have described these to me where if they had a gun in their home, they would have used it on themselves. So some people are taken over and do not survive the encounter, just as some people don't survive microbiological adversaries either. And it's Nietzsche, the German philosopher, said, "What doesn't kill us makes us stronger," which is a very Germanic sentiment. But on the other hand, Nietzsche died completely insane from the effects of syphilis, so that principle can be carried too far. And we can only pray and ask for help from some of the other entities that are out there that are benign, just as we see benign entities in Alex's painting. It's not all bad stuff out there. Sometimes we have to call on help from a higher power, and whatever your spiritual tradition is, if you can't handle it, call on help.
Do you think Alex's paintings would be as good as they are had he not tried mind-altering drugs?
I think Alex was such a visionary in potentia, he probably would have found some way to them. Not that I'm in any way criticizing the path that he took, far from it. We see William Blake. I don't think that William Blake, not that I'm aware of, took any mind-altering substances, and this is somebody who painted and created poetry in around 1800. And yet he was a tremendous visionary, as was Michelangelo. So there are, as Alex acknowledged, there are many ways into this. It's not the substance that does anything. The potential for these visions is what exists inside of us. If you give LSD or something to a computer, nothing happens. It is only because we have the potential for that to open a door. A substance can catalyze that, but we can open that door at other times, like when we dream, without taking anything.
Let's go west of the Rockies. Welcome to Coast to Coast. It's your turn. Hi there.
Good evening. This
yes, sir.
is Tony from Los Angeles.
Okay, Tony.
I have a psychic vampire story, but I may have some food for thought because I was listening to your other callers. I have, over the years, have had lots of out-of-body experiences, and I can see other planes and other spirits and all kinds of things. And there was a point in my life Are you still there?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I'm sorry. There's a point in my life where I was, for many reasons, I was very exhausted and very frustrated with things that were going on, and I was starting to get harassed by an entity repeatedly who liked to, when I would be in that half state of being half out of my body and half in my body, he would attack me and try to restrain me and fight me and tire me out more and stuff like that. The final fight that I had with this thing was I had come to the point where I just got good at it. I got good at fighting him, and I was relentless in my hitting him and punching him, and he would try to change his face, and he would try to scare me with like a demonic kind of face and stuff, and I kind of saw through his charade. And anyway, I kept beating on him, and then I popped back into my body, and when that happened, I looked up at my ceiling, and there was physically a red light on spread across my ceiling, which had never happened before. Usually when I'm out of my body, it doesn't bleed into my physical life.
Right.
In this case, it did. But that was the last time that this thing attacked me, and like I said, the food for thought would be you just get good at it. And he got, I think what happened was he just realized that he wasn't allowed to pick on me anymore. And this was after many, I had maybe a dozen fights with this entity over a period of time, over a period of a year or a year and a half.
Jonathan, does that work? Do people have the ability to, like Tony, train themselves to do this and fight it off?
Absolutely. And that's why we the last thing we want to do is encourage anybody to think of themselves as a victim. This is all about taking back your power, which is ultimately superior, as we see in Alex's painting, where there's a human figure that's transcending the food chain. So you do have an ability to resist. It's very interesting that this happened when you were kind of half out of the body, because now you're stepping out into that astral plane where part of us lives as well, especially during the dream time when when people take these substances, as Alex did. He's somewhat out of the body at that point, and that's where they live. That we're entering their domain to some extent. But you saw through the charade. You saw that these beings, they're kind of like Wizard of Oz, that seems like this great gigantic figure, but then you pull back the curtain and see there's really just this puny thing back there that's trying to scare you. Like the Scarecrow in the new Batman movie, there is really just a very ordinary person, but when he can spray you with that chemical or something that causes you to see evil hallucinations, then you can be terrified and turned into a quaking gelatinous mass. But because you were courageous and because you didn't give in to the show of deceiving things, like what the Gnostics said about the Archons, they said they were masters of deception. Well, you didn't fall for the deceptions. You clung to your right to defend your sovereign domain, and I think that's a great story.
Is it dangerous to do OBEs? I mean, I did one when I was 11 or 12 by accident. I've never been able to duplicate it. But can you get possessed when you're floating around in your astral body?
Well, Robert Monroe seemed to say no. He relentlessly defended this is a safe practice. And I've had numerous out-of-body experiences myself, and I don't think that's happened to me. But, never say never. The human experience is so various that anything's possible. But it's kind of like saying, if I go camping, will I be safe? Well, in most cases, yes. You're safer out in the woods than you are in the city. On the other hand, few very rare people are attacked by bears. So we shouldn't give up exploring. We need to go out into these other domains, and out-of-body experiences totally transform my life. I mean, for one thing, when you experience that your psyche can exist outside of your body and be incredibly enhanced and energized by that, your fear of death can just vanish in a moment. And so I think that there are risks everywhere we travel, and not particularly so with out-of-body experiences, but no one is going to give you a guarantee. Certainly, I'm not going to.
Well, all I know is if you come on the program again and your voice changes to a demon, then we're going to know that something happened to you in an OBE, Jonathan.
Yeah. I'll be on the lookout for that.
East of the Rockies, it's your turn. You're on Coast to Coast. Hi there.
Yeah, hi. I wanted to ask two questions, actually. One was, first of all, I wanted to ask about the how you can tell the difference, really, between something like this, a psychic vampire kind of thing, or just plain old depression or other kinds of emotional problems that are brought up by, let's say, a particular person or a situation. How do you tell the difference between what you're talking about, which is spiritual, and just psychology, really? And that was my one question. And the other question I wanted to ask about was, I was really concerned about you're saying that Hezbollah really was the kind of like the evil force in all of this going on in the Middle East, when it seems like everybody now is sort of acting on the same wavelength, the same page, and certainly, I mean, I don't think the Israelis are acting any more spiritually enlightened, when everybody's watching people being children and women and everybody being blown to bits and without even batting an eyelash, So seems like the evil is spread everywhere. I don't know.
All right, we'll take both of those questions, Jonathan, when we come back right after the break. And that is, again, how do people know that they're under a psychic vampire attack, or how do you know who a psychic vampire is? And then evil, pure evil, maybe it's everywhere these days. We'll be back in a moment with our special guest, Jonathan Zapp, right here on Coast to Coast AM. We'll still take your questions. Well, on our next Coast to Coast program, our special guest will be Glenn Kimball, Ancient Manuscripts and Hidden Artifacts. So get ready for that. I think we'll also talk with Glenn a little bit about that Bosnian pyramid. And, he's uncovered some incredible things here very close by in Illinois. So we'll get some updates from Glenn on that as well on our next Coast to Coast show. Jonathan, let's pick up the last couple questions about, first of all, how do you know if you're being approached by a psychic vampire? Do you feel it? I mean, let's take that one first.
Okay, and these were two great things to come up. The first one, it is a qualitative intuition. And in some cases, it feels like an outside attack. I give examples that happened to me in some of the writings on the website. In other cases, you're aware of something being more internal. It's kind of like when you have a dream, and sometimes you realize these are my dream characters, my dream is creating. Other times you realize that something else has come into it. Now, people who don't know their own psychology and haven't integrated their shadow, an external force, something could feel very external but really be a reflection of them. So it's a very slippery slope. And what I would say is, perception is to some extent a choice. It's not just that one is true and one is false. I would say whether you take the psychological point of view and your depression or inner chaos or the mind parasite, take the one that empowers you. And, think about it from each way and see which way gives you a way out and a handle on the situation and go with that. Okay.
Now, the other one, of course, was Hezbollah. And, right. When we talk about pure evil, I guess to me, the Israelis were not evil. I mean, they were as aggressive as they had to be, unfortunately, when they went after Hezbollah, and innocent people were killed. And that is always the sadness of war. But you know what? If we can put an end to these tragedies, maybe more lives in the long run will be saved. I mean, it's a bad situation for everybody.
Absolutely, and that's why we don't want to encourage projection and name-calling and saying, and that kind of thing. But I think there's a multi-part answer to what she brought up. One answer is for her to listen to the Thursday night show when you had the gentleman on who was brought up in the PLO, and he tells you in great detail, and this is a man of great courage who's lost the affections of his family by being willing to come out and tell the truth, how he was brought up to hate Jews and to believe believe in an ideology, a delusionary ideology of hatred and violence. And then when he encountered Jews and pretended that he wasn't a Palestinian and so forth, he discovered that they didn't have that hate for him. And, I have to say, my family is both Palestinian and Jewish. It's kind of a strange story, but you can read about that on the website. And I know you have, Middle Eastern ancestry as well.
Mm-hmm.
And but we don't have to have, there is a fanatical ideology that's driving some people toward jihad against the world. And I think that some people on the left, which is usually where I find myself, but I think a lot of people there are missing the boat. They tend to think, well, two parties are fighting, war is bad, the truth must be in the middle, each of them is half wrong. But things aren't always symmetrical. And there's a very big difference between the Israelis, who are not perfect, no government is perfect, I don't trust any government, but they might be a light medium gray, but a group that seeks martyrdom, that kills other Muslims with great fanaticism and kills their own women, and is driven by a fanatical, diabolical ideology of hate, that is a much, much darker shade of gray. And we can be blindsided by the dark force if we don't see, yes, that the color is right, the darkness is in every one of us. No question about that. But the darkness, like every other property of the universe, is unevenly distributed. And we don't get blindsided by underestimating that darkness. And I challenge people who feel it's half and half or something like that to read Projection, the Enemy of Peace on my website and Jihad Against the Feminine. And then if you don't buy it, challenge me back. You can leave comments there. A large part of it is a dialogue with an Islamic imam. And you'll hear what he has to say, too. I'm open to challenge on this. I'm not free of projections either.
Very good. Let's go back to the phones. Wildcard line, you're on the air with us on Coast to Coast. Hi there.
Hi, George.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, my name's Scott. I'm from Utah, in Utah. Scotty. I'm a truck driver. I was at the casinos one time, and there was a short feller that come up behind me, and it just seemed like I was doing good and doing real good. And then he come up behind me, and I got really nervous and agitated, and I got mad. I mean, actually mad, and just trying to be polite. I kept looking over my shoulder, and he was just staring at me. And then finally I turned around and said, would you please move? And I actually yelled at him.
He's the cooler.
Please?
The casino probably hired him to slow you down.
Okay, but I've got a question, too, now. Does the psychic vampire have to be in a human form or something? Because my cat, one time I was laying in bed and I was asleep, and my cat was nose to nose to me, and it just felt like she was drawing energy from me.
Mm-hmm. Two interesting observations there. The first one about in the casino, well, you might know that there's a movie that just came out in the last year called The Cooler. I think William Macy was the star of it. It's about somebody that are people that are hired by casinos, that when somebody's having a run of luck, they're energy sappers. And that's what he is. He's a low self-esteem energy sapper.
And Macy did a great job with it.
I didn't actually see it. Obviously, you have.
Great
but
movie.
I'm
Loved
going to
it.
have to see that one now. And with the other thing, it's like they say about the devil, its form is legion.
Right.
I think it can work in all kinds of different ways. We know I'm a huge cat person. I even do some work for big cats as well. But there's something coming out now about a parasite called Toxoplasma gondii, I think, and it's carried by cats. The cats are completely innocent in this, but apparently it's infected half of all human beings on the planet, and it causes psychological changes. So the point is that anything can be a carrier of other forces, and that's exactly how parasites work. Some of them will go through 5 different animals, controlling their behavior to allow them to complete their life cycle. So anything with that is possible.
Well, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. Appreciate you being part of the program. Let's go now, Steve. You're going to have to plug it up for me, a wild card line. You're on the air with us. Hi there.
Hello, my name's Jack.
Hey, Jack, go ahead, sir.
I wanted to ask Jonathan about the ancient term necromancer, as in an incorporeal evil that settles over an entire town or village and just seems to wreak havoc for months, years at a time. That's my question anyway.
Okay. Well, there are I think it was Abe Fortas who coined the term window zones, and the Mothman books are about this, about a town, just like in a fictional way. It is about this too, where a particular area can become a window zone where strange things happen. I have a lot of friends in Seattle, and something like that seemed to happen where one Halloween there was some kind of a party where people dressed up as spooks and so forth, and the dead and so on, and then some kind of bizarre serial killer showed up and in a completely unmotivated way killed a whole bunch of people. And then there was a whole run of other strange murders happening in this town that is known for its low murder rate. So these things seem to crop up. But I was interested in your phrase necromancer, which I never heard applied to this, but it has a relationship to Gnosticism and to Tolkien, because in the Tolkien mythology that you can read in his Silmarillion, Sauron, the evil figure that we know in Lord of the Rings, behind him is Morgoth, and Morgoth would correspond to the Archons' demiurge, which is like the chief of the Archons. And in fact, there's one of the books of his collected writings called Morgoth's Ring. From Tolkien's cosmology, all of Arda, all of what the Earth, that was the name for it, was Morgoth's Ring. It had all been infused with his presence and power. And the Gnostic says something similar, that this whole realm, they weren't against the Earth, but they felt that this whole realm was kind of parasite infected and had deception and things woven into it.
Okay, thanks for that. Let's move next to our West of the Rockies line. You're on the air with us. Hi there.
Yes, hi. This is Darian Lynn from Montana.
Yeah, Darian.
And I guess my question, or actually question and comment is, based on all the world religions, there's 2,500 deities or so, and most of them, or all of them, actually require servitude on one level or another. And I've always had an issue with that, because to me, if someone was the creator or there is a creator, I would not require servitude. And to me, servitude and surrender are actually actions that I consider of the dark light. And I would kind of generally apply that to the world situation now, where everyone is grasping towards their religion and praying for all of the salvation. And from my perspective, it actually seems to be manifesting it in more of a negative sense than a positive one.
These are really excellent points, and I absolutely agree with you, and the Gnostics would as well. There are positive and benign entities out there, of course, but there's a qualitative difference here where they tend to be a gentle influence. They don't take over your will. That's a real difference there, and they don't demand obedience. It's like I'm reminded of the diabolical figure played by David Bowie in the movie Labyrinth, where he says, "Love me, fear me, obey me, and I'll be your slave forever." So when we see this kind of attempt to master you, you had Howard Bloom on the other day, and he talked about how, even in the so-called golden age of when Islam, Jews were living with Islamists in Spain, that they had to adopt an inferior status and had to walk in the gutter and avert their eyes and so forth. They had to acknowledge them as the masters. When something is trying to master you, whether it's a person, an entity, or an ideology, that is obviously a warning sign. And don't let anything, don't surrender your power to anything.
Is there anything that science is doing right now to deal with what I now believe to be is a very true problem, in that of energy sappers or psychic vampires? I mean, since the day of my aunt, is anybody doing anything medically anymore?
Well, I guess the answer is that the most was done in the past by the physicians of Ayurveda, the traditional medicine of India, the study of disincarnate entities and how they made people ill was a medical specialty on par with gynecology. And the acupuncturists, the Chinese Taoists, were well aware of it, and so forth. And they had very specific techniques for dealing with it and for cleansing these entities. Unfortunately, at the moment, Western science, though I think it will come around, has trouble recognizing energy. It'll recognize some things, like it recognizes that acupuncture works, but it is unable to acknowledge why it works. And so I hope we get to the time where this will be acknowledged, and we may find, just like we have these amazing scanners that can pick up things and see things that we could never see before, with MREs and so forth. It's perfectly possible that these entities are physical, even if they're not solid. That science may discover ways to see them and deal with them and everything else in the future.
Since the days of J.B. Rhine at Duke University, we really, though, haven't had full-fledged studies into this area.
Well, absolutely, and it's a shame. It's a shame we find on many levels. You had Michael Cremo on, and he talked about the knowledge filtration that goes on, and how, and this may be a way of keeping that homeostasis that allows the harvest to go on, because some things are legitimate subjects for inquiry and others aren't. And it's really astounding and incredibly disappointing, on par with our, not going back to the moon and not continuing the space exploration that we got going. Parapsychology made this brilliant beginning with Rhine in this country and was abandoned and became like the redheaded stepchild of the scientific world. And yet something to keep in mind is, if there is only one valid case of telepathy in all of human history, one mother who remote from sensory information knew specifically how her kid was in trouble, if any one experiment was valid, then, from that principle that all it takes to disprove the notion that all crows are black as one white crow, it throws open that possibility as part of the human performance envelope for all time. These are the most important things that we could be studying, and it really is a terrible and tragic shame that we're not doing it. But other countries, China, Russia, are pursuing these things, and they may pull ahead of us in some important areas because of our neglect.
Next up, let's go to our first-time caller line. You're on the air with us. Hi there.
Yeah, hi there. This is Paul in Phoenix.
Hi, Paul.
Yeah, I'm wondering about my severe insomnia. Is that a sign that I'm under psychic attack?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because, what can happen is when something is not recognized for a while, then when it is recognized, it can be attributed to everything. For example, for centuries, we ignored the reports of child abuse. Then when we suddenly became aware of it, we became aware of it to the extent where we saw it everywhere, even when it wasn't, and there were all kinds of people that were taken to court and so forth and had their lives ruined only to be shown innocent later on. And there was a best-selling, New York Times best-selling book on child abuse that reported as symptoms that you might have been abused as a child were insomnia, depression, tiredness, headaches, remembering abuse, not remembering abuse. Yeah. So absolutely, insomnia could be caused by it, but we would have to know more, because so many ordinary things could cause it, and there's a principle of logic called Occam's razor that says hypotheses are not multiplied without necessity. If you can explain something in a very ordinary way, you don't reach for a less ordinary cause unless you have something that really compels you to look in that direction.
Okay.
All right. Hope that helped you there. Let's move to our next wild card line. Your turn. Hi there.
Hi.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
I'm Annie, and I'm from Northern California. I wanted to make a comment about kind of in defense of clowns. as I do clowning myself, and the clown that you speak of is more of the clown in Western societies, but the clown has been a part of ancient cultures for just thousands of years. There's clowns in New Guinea, in societies in New Guinea, and there's, of course, indigenous clowns in this country with the native clowns in various tribes. And I think in the Western tradition, though, we get this idea of the parasite because originally the clowns or the fools and the buffoons in communities were the developmentally disabled, the people who we now institutionalize. And, the madmen, for instance, or the village fool, they were looked at disparagingly. And finally, what happened was that they went on to kind of band together as buffoons, and they would appear once a year in the community and put on a kind of a parade and a show. And it sort of started a tradition which led up to eventually the court fools. And But because of this this initial view of clowns, they've always had this shadow of being the parasite, and because they kind of lived off of the wealthier people just by doing their performance and collecting money and so on. And
would you agree with that? And I've got to cut you short a little bit only because we're running out of time. Jonathan, 20 seconds left.
No, not entirely, because I think that history is probably true, but it was also true of actors. You know, even Shakespeare, in Shakespeare's day, that was considered, and even into the 19th century, was considered disreputable. It was considered, a notch above being a prostitute. And so clowns were just part of that court jester thing. But I think the contemporary fear of clowns comes from somewhere else.
Jonathan, thanks so much for being on the program.
Thank you.
Jonathan Zapp. For Steve Carr, Dan Galanti, Tom Danheiser, Lisa Lyon, Lex Lonehood, Sean Ladesseur, Ross Mitchell, Ian Punnett, and Art Bell. I'm George Norrie, somewhere out there on Coast to Coast AM. I'll see you on our next edition. Until then, be safe.